things would just be better at Mass. People could come, fulfill their obligation, get what they came for. Priests could celebrate Mass on Sundays without the burden of preparing a sermon, and the people could come to Mass and then make it home sooner. Those who prepared the singing and the choir at Mass could expand their repertoire and wouldn't have to worry about constraints with regard to time. And seminaries could relieve themselves of the complaints that seminary graduates didn't know anything about preaching. And in addition, which was probably his most central concern, it would relieve the concern of many people listening or trying to listen to their priest preach at Mass. So the liturgy was universal, at least in the sense that it was in Latin. But of course, saying Latin at the altar at Mass doesn't quite address preaching for certain. It also doesn't address what you do when grandma is depressed, or when dad kills himself, or when Junior runs off and joins the Marine Corps, and you're in a parish where you can't speak the language of the people. And his concern was, it's certainly in the growing welter of new languages arriving in New York every day, what to do to serve the people. If no one expected preaching to take place, then everyone would be on the same level. Everyone could simply come to Mass and expect that everything would be the same everywhere. And in the world of European society that was arriving at that time, where education had played very little part in uniting the people, there were dialects and languages that no one had ever heard of. Well, even a place like Italy. Italy as a country is not as old as Iowa is a state. And so there were no such things as an Italian priest. There were people who spoke the dialect of Rome, which became Italian. But if you were from Naples or Calabria or Sicily, or, 20 different places in Italy, you could easily speak a dialect that no one understood, and you wouldn't understand them. And so you could have an entire parish full of people who were Italians, but they couldn't speak the language of Rome, and someone from Rome or Sicily or Calabria or Naples couldn't speak to them. What do you do about finding them a pastor? Wouldn't it be better if everybody simply came to Mass and had the same experience? And that's not to mention all of those places like the Poles and the Hungarians and the Moldavans and the Ruthenians and the Germans and the Czechs, all of whom have varieties and dialects in their languages that most people have never heard of. Even a place like Germany at the turn of the 20th century was full of dialects that the average German simply didn't know. It was a real challenge. Finding preachers in those languages would be difficult. So why not just do away with preaching altogether, he thought. It'd be a step ahead. It would make Mass actually universal for everyone. We'll just settle on one language, and that'll be the end of it, and no one has to worry about what that guy at the pulpit might try to say in this language of mine. We've addressed some of this in the history of the church in the United States, because we've been a country, of course, filled with immigrants from our founding, and they brought this babel of confusing languages and dialects with them. It was Ben Franklin who wondered if the Pennsylvania Dutch would ever, in fact, become decent Americans because they were obtuse in not giving up the German that they spoke. He was just anxious that it would be possible for us to be a country together if people wouldn't give up this language that they brought with them. It's been a concern. And in many ways, this young priest in 1919 was initiating the kind of settlement that has been comfortable for us in the United States, actually imitating a kind of French example in that we've adopted the notion that real Americans speak English and they don't speak anything else. In the book, The Discovery of France by Graham Roble, he described that at the time of the French Revolution and after, all the way really until the beginning of the 20th century, in France, the constant complaint was that no one spoke French. 5 miles outside of Paris, you could come to a village where the people of Paris couldn't understand what they said. They spoke a dialect that was so completely different, or perhaps a language that was so completely different that no one understood. When France was studying the troops that they called up during the First World War, they found out that the first language of 20% of Frenchmen was German, not to mention the dialects in a place like Brittany that wasn't French at all in any way, not even Latinate. But the revolutionaries were concerned to create a modern state, especially one that was centralized, where everyone, as part of a modern state, sharing all the same modern ideas, would speak the same language. And so they worked to stamp out all of the local particularities and to stamp out the dialects. At least they made it an ideal that no one would be sullied by these minor languages that was lesser than the dialect of Paris, which became the French that is for the nation. And so, as Graham Roble said, in a country of 100 languages and 1,000 dialects, it became the mark of sophistication to speak only one language. We've kind of adopted that for ourselves. We carried that through in our national ethos. You can see where the energy propelling that young priest came from, especially in a welter of places like New York City. There would be those who would be happy to echo his concerns even today. The church, of course, universally said no. Even in those days when preaching was thought mostly to be a concern for Protestants, the long tradition of the liturgy wouldn't allow it. The best understanding of the celebration of Mass, the liturgy of the Word, has always been present, even if it had been disvalued, which certainly helped to explain the origin of the concern or the idea or this movement of this priest. Even at the time, the sermons of John Chrysostom and Augustine were studied and recommended. The sermons of Gregory the Great and Bruno and Bernard were great, those men who were recognized as great preachers, and the examples that they left behind weren't ignored. And while parish priests couldn't strive to their heights, it would not be the case that the possibility of hearing something worthwhile at Mass to sustain the spiritual life would something that would be removed. So, after some time and a lot of agitation, this liturgical pioneer was told to just shut down his enterprise. Oddly, he had spent a lot of time and energy finding the words to justify removing the words of preaching from Mass. It was a paradox I'm not sure he was aware of. As these characters do, he faded from history. And I bring up that for everyone to understand two principal points. The first is a repetition of my first point, which is there are no perfect times in the history of the church. We're always in motion, like I said before. We're always asking and then answering. We're always formulating the question. Sometimes it takes a generation. Sometimes it takes 100 years to formulate the question so that we can look for an answer. We're always in the process of looking for the answers for the questions that we have, or living out the experience so that we can summon the energy to formulate the questions that inform the experience that we have. And I mention all of that because the signal element of the experience of Stan Rother when he went to Guatemala was that he had to settle down into his parish and to meet the needs of the people there. And he did that, first of all, by focusing on learning their language. something ironic for a guy who failed Latin. But he learned Tz'utujil, one of the 19 extant Mayan languages spoken in Guatemala. He settled down and studied Tz'utujil with a kind of avid energy that he never had for Latin. And it's not easy, it's easy to understand why. First of all, it was a living language. So anything that he learned was a breakthrough experience when he was able to communicate with the people that he was speaking to directly. Second of all, it was an absolute imperative if he's going to become the leader of the parish. At that time, in 1968, probably less than 10% of the parish could actually speak Spanish. Oh, he was also in the process of learning Spanish as well, but the bulk of his people spoke only Tz'utujil. Certainly the women and the children spoke Tz'utujil and nothing else. Some of the men, especially those who were outside of the village, would speak Spanish, at least to some extent. But so that was his first imperative, was to be present to them and to learn their language. It's ironic, of course, that in the measure of things, those who would go from village to village as traders and merchants would often speak many languages, but they were generally dismissed. And Guatemala is a place where the indigenous presence is simply overwhelming in just about every part of the country. And those who speak Spanish, as well as an Indian language, or sometimes many Indian languages, are often simply left off to the side because they're indigenous. They're called, don't write this word down, they're called indito. That's the N word in Latin America for the Native American. Indito. It's completely dismissive and insulting. I was at a meeting down in Mexico City with the sisters that had come up to work in Oklahoma. And they had asked me to come down and be a part of a discussion that they were having about why it was that their order couldn't attract native indigenous women from southern Mexico and Guatemala. There is a huge kind of untapped market for these women who had no access to education and no access to a wider world, that if they were a part of this religious order, of course, education and this great possibility for advancement in the world would open up for them. It seemed obvious to the sisters there, why don't we attract Native American women to our order? Now, they had a few there, and the women who talked, this conversation went on for 3 days. Of course, I'm on the outside, and when asked, I responded, but this was the conversation happening between them. Of course, it was easy very quickly to notice things that they didn't notice. One was they had several women from Guatemala who were there. Now, these were Native women, Native American, indigenous. All of them spoke at least 5 different languages. 5 different languages. You might say they're all Mayan languages, but French, Italian, Portuguese, Romansh, Romanian, and Spanish, and Catalan are all Latinate languages. They're different. Speaking all of them would be quite an accomplishment. These women that they had there at the meeting spoke a minimum of 5 languages. All the women involved in the discussion spoke only Spanish, just one language. But there was never a time during the meeting when those who were initiating the discussion, why don't indigenous girls come to the order? There wasn't one time they stopped and asked any of the indigenous women there what they thought. No one asked them. It simply never occurred to anyone to ask them. They were left behind. Eventually, this is what they did, this religious order decided. We're just going to keep doing what we do and hope more people respond. Sounds like a perfectly Catholic way to respond. Well, the challenge to communicate and to relate was the goal of the Oklahoma missionaries. It was to bring the life of the faith to the people and to make it into a living presence, not simply a kind of distant celebration. It was to bring it into the life of the people, which is why one of the premier focus of the Oklahoma presence there was to make what was available in their language. First by translating the scriptures, which they did, as I mentioned before, first the Sunday readings and then the daily readings. It took, again, with the interruption of the Civil War, it took until 1995 for the New Testament finally to be finished and published in Tsutuhil. But they also struggled to bring the liturgy to the people. After all, they'd been without a pastor for 100 years, and because they were there without a pastor for 100 years, there was probably no one in town who had been to Mass more than 5 or 6 times in his life. When the Oklahomans came and began to celebrate Mass on Sunday, in a town of 30,000 people, they had 5 or 6 people who came to church. And so to be able to begin to interconnect what they did in the language of the people was one of the premium concerns that they have. The focus was to put Tsutuhil into a written language. That was an Anglo concern, but we've done pretty well with languages written down, not just oral. And that way to be able to bring it to the people, and then to avoid the temptation that is almost irresistible, which is to tell ourselves and then tell the people that when you all learn the right language, then we can deal with you. But until then, well, we're just going to kind of keep things going until you all learn the right language. But in the ministry, of course, Spanish was spoken by some men and not by women and not by children at all. Stan learned it, which was one of the things that set him apart from the other Americans. I'm not certain that it was because of his particular skill at it. There was an Anglo who lived in the village who wrote a series of books. He was one of these interesting Anglos who is absolutely besotted by the opportunity to discover native traditions and native culture. And he made fun of Stan and Stan's pronunciation and the way Stan spoke Tsutuhil. He made fun of him in several of the books that he wrote. Now, this guy was not a native Tsutuhil speaker. He was an Anglo from Arizona. And so what he knew of the language, I have no idea. And what you can trust of his evaluation, I have no idea. He mostly hated people in authority, and he mostly hated the pastor there. So it's hard to know what his critique was about. So I have no idea, actually, how good Stan's Tsutuhil was, or what the people thought of what he was saying. But it was his connection to the people, and one that he pursued the whole time he was there. He got better and better at it because it was what he gave himself to be able to speak the language. Now, there's a couple of things about that. First of all, when you go out to speak, when you go out to learn a language, you become vulnerable. And you become vulnerable for all kinds of reasons. There's obviously everyone there speaks the language better than you. The smallest kid who can speak speaks better than you. But there's also the inevitable difficulties that crop up when you're learning a language. The priest who took Father Stan's place was Tom McSherry, priest from the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City. He went and stayed 17 years in the village. It's safe to say Tom was not a linguist. He never much learned Tsutuhil. But one day when I was visiting, he told me that the word for baby in Tsutuhil is ch'uch. Tsutuhil sounds like Klingon, ch'uch. And so every chance I got when I walked into the village, I would point to a little baby, usually held in its mother's arms, and use the words I know, which was the word for baby and then the word for precious and beautiful and special, which is one word in Tsutuhil, and it's the word uts. Ch'uch, uts. Beautiful, precious little baby. And the response every time I used that was, so that's a pretty bad accent. I mean, but I'm doing my best, right? I'm doing my best. In 2021, in my sabbatical year, I spent a month in Guatemala at Quetzaltenango studying Quiché. It's one of the major Mayan languages. People who come up to Oklahoma, especially some women, don't speak Spanish very well. In fact, if they go to confession, they struggle to try to get out what they want to say because their Spanish is really, really bad. So I thought, if I just learned a little bit of some of the Mayan words, some Quiché, maybe I could be helpful. And the first thing I learned was that the word ch'uch doesn't mean baby. It means the mother of the baby. Cute, precious, beautiful mother of the baby. Fortunately, I made it out of the village without being assassinated. So multiply that 1,000 times. Of course, that's what it's like to learn a language, especially on the fly, especially when you're in charge of trying to make this work. It's the sacrifice of perfection in service to the people. So, of course, the imperative all of us have is to learn the language. In fact, it's a mark of one of the major grave concerns of the Catholic Church in the United States, that we always have been challenged to learn the language. If I had it to do all over again, if I were starting out in 1981, if I could simply step back, one of the things that I would do is keep up my visiting and my relationship with our cousins who still live in Germany. I went to visit several times. I spent several weeks with them. None of them spoke any English, and it was a fabulous experience to be able to deepen the German that I know. My mother only spoke German when she started school, but all I learned were prayers and the curse words, both of which were helpful in Germany, but not for extended conversation. And I would work on my French. I actually was a translator for visiting some friends of mine. If you're the only person who knows any words in the other language, you become the translator and nobody can correct you. So, but if I could do that over again with just that much more effort, my German and my French would be incomparably better if I just would have spent some time on it. But you know, that's not exactly the preoccupation that I'm talking about. It's not simply about grammar and vocabulary. To learn to speak the language of the parish is a sign of the connection and the commitment and the capacity that we have to serve them, which means most of all, to learn the language is to enter into the pasture, and as the Pope says, to have the smell of the sheep on the shepherd, to leave the doors open so you can, or his example, to leave the doors of the church open so you can get out to where the people are. We should have open doors in the churches, not so that we focus on making sure everybody comes in, but that those who are in can go out. And learning the language is part of that. But you know, it's not just whether you speak Spanish or Sutujil or French or German or any of the other 50 languages in our dioceses. It's this: to learn to speak the language of the people is to learn to speak the language of their situation and their life. For example, 3 of my assignments in the course of my priesthood have included being chaplain to prisons. And I loathed it, especially the first 2. The bars, the security, the general hostility of the guards and the prisoners. Every week, the best thing I saw every week was when I got in the car and looked at the rearview mirror and saw the gate of the prison getting smaller and smaller as I drove away, which lasted about 24 hours until I began dreading going there again the next week. But I got to a parish where, because of the situation in the parish, I began to go to the county jail several times a week. I had, as I used to joke, but it was true, I had a small parish in the county jail all the time. They changed all the time, like people in parishes do, but I had a regular small community in the county jail that I would go to see. And in the course of that, over the course of time, it took me years, I learned how to speak to prisoners. I also learned about the corruption and the vileness of criminal justice, at least in that county. But in short, what happened was that I got to know my parish. After that assignment, my next assignment included the largest women's prison in the state of Oklahoma. Now, you may not know this, but the United States imprisons more people per capita than any other country in the world. And Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma, imprisons more women as a portion of their population than any other state in the Union. The state of Oklahoma imprisons more women than any other jurisdiction in the world. And I was the chaplain at that prison. And I loved it. I learned in the course of that time how to speak to prisoners. I learned the language of prison life. I learned that you can't solve prisoners' problems. I learned that you're there to make the gospel available to those who need hope the most. I learned not to speak about what happens later on or what happens when you get out, but what happens today. And I learned that the temptations in prison life are always intricate, but what? They're always right now. And when you're speaking to them, you speak a message of hope and promise, of forgiveness and forbearance, a message that everyone needs to hear, but especially those who are wading through a mountain of remorse and resentment and anger and abandonment in scales that we can hardly imagine. But to know that I could go there and encounter them, and I learned from them and they learned from me, was the most liberating experience I've ever had in my life. I look forward every week to be able to go to the prison and spend my day there, to be with those people, to listen to them, and to be a part of their lives. I learned the language of the incarcerated. That was Stan's gift, his connection to his people. As I said before, our image of him sitting in his room writing out the translation of the scriptures wasn't very accurate. It was accurate that his effectiveness had everything to do with his willingness to sit and to be with and to learn the language that he needed to learn. Whether he spoke it well or not, so that, there was no Anglo accent when he spoke in Mayan, Who knows? But you see, that doesn't matter. In the history of Oklahoma, the three great pioneers of Hispanic ministry in Oklahoma couldn't speak Spanish. I mean, they tried. My pastor was one of them. He spent 15 years learning Spanish, and after 15 years, he could say, "Hola, me llamo Jose, ¿cómo está usted?" That was the limit of everything. But he was sincere and committed, and his overwhelming desire to connect with those people, even if that's the only words sincerely that he could learn, that was overwhelmingly effective for them and for him. I would get up in the morning and hear him with his tape player running in the bathroom saying, "Hola, me llamo Jose, ¿cómo está usted?" The commitment to the people. That's what learning the language is. And you know, for Stan, this is a positive thing. This was an essential part of his martyrdom. In this sense, he was the guy that the authorities there, the army that occupied the village, wanted to get. They wanted to know what he knew. 13 years a pastor, all of the energies that flowed around in that parish, he knew the language, the army didn't. They wanted to know what he knew about the people and the activities and the plans and the kinds of things that were taking place there. He was the kind of guy who would have known those things because of his connection to the people. They came to get him because of what he knew, because of his position, and because of his ability. His beatification had everything to do with the fact that he was killed for trying to be a good pastor, for being extraordinarily connected to his people. If there's a reason to be a witness, a martyr, that would be it. To be known as that kind of witness, I think, is what is in prospect for us, or I think it should be. Now, to do that, we have to there's some difficulties, and there are always difficulties in the life in the pastoral life. But one of the first difficulties in being present and disposing ourselves to learning the language of the people is this. The first one is that we have to confront our fears. Our first fear, of course, is that we're not in control. We might be the pastor, we might be the one who's entrusted administratively, and we might be the one whose job it is to kind of keep all this together. But if we choose to stand where they stand, we make ourselves vulnerable and we're not in control. In the second place where I was chaplain, I was in the protective custody pod. So I would go in, I would have Mass for the trustees, they were outside the walls. Then I would have Mass in the protective custody pod. These were the guys who were being protected from all the other prisoners. And then I would go out to the main chapel and have Mass for all the rest of the prisoners who wanted to come. Has anybody seen the movie Nefarious? I was chaplain at that prison. And they actually do a good job of showing, they went there and filmed at least the outside shots in there. So I was chaplain there. So one day, I'm in the protective custody pod. We're getting ready to have Mass. Okay, this is prison, guys. There's a guy who walks by dressed in a white wedding dress. Kind of curious. I knew not to ask any questions. I didn't really want, they would have told me, I didn't want to know. If I knew, then I'd be responsible for knowing. I didn't want to know. Anyways. I pretty much knew. I didn't want to. But you know, when you're in the protective custody pod and you're the chaplain, you're vulnerable in a way you're not vulnerable even out in the general population. You're the different guy. You're the guy who has to learn, not the guy who has to teach. At least not about being there, about connecting to what they need and who they are. You're not in control. You're there as a student. You're there as a pastor who makes sheep go where they shouldn't go, or who turns sheep into a place with no grass is not much of a shepherd. You have to learn. One day, as we were in the main chapel, the guards would invite everybody to come in, and then the guards come and lock the door so nobody can leave until Mass is over. They come and unlock the door when we're finished, not a problem. Well, that day, we were late, they were late, and the guards forgot that we were in the chapel. So they began their count. And so one of the guys simply said, you know, unless we go tell them, the count's going to come up wrong, and then they'll freeze everything in place, and then they'll do it again, and then somebody will remember we're here, and it'll be 3 hours before we're out of here. So one of the guys volunteered to jump out the window and walk across the yard, right, to let them know we were still in there. And so he's poised on the windowsill as he's about ready to jump off the windowsill onto the ground, and he says, you know, it ought to be somebody else. He says, I was a medic in the Army. I know how to fix a sucking chest wound. You become vulnerable. You learn. That's what it means to learn a language. Second thing, and I mentioned this before, is you have to confront your own ignorance. The youngest kid knows more than you know. When I was in Southwest Oklahoma, I had never studied Spanish before, not even in grade school. I knew not one word of Spanish. I knew that the Spanish word for yes was sí, but I didn't know what the Spanish word for no was. And so I was at this family's house, and little Hugo Gonzalez was there. And Hugo, who was about 5 years old, he pointed to a cat that was walking across the living room, and he said, gato. And I said, okay, gato, the word for cat. And then I thought, I wonder if it's a boy cat, it's gato. If it's a girl cat, is it gata? And so I said, gato or gata? And Hugo goes, and then he picks the cat up, turns it over, looks between his legs, and says, gato. When you're ignorant, that's what you are. You know, I went to school for 21 years in a row. And, you know, when you go to school for 21 years in a row, you learn stuff. In fact, you know a lot more than most people know about most things after 21 years in school. But if you're going to stand with your people, and you're going to be there present to them, and you are going to enter into their world rather than simply invite them into your world, then you have to confront your own ignorance, confront your own fear, and begin to learn their language. You have to confront your own limitations. It's all really about fear and about ignorance. Those are one of our limitations. We are who we are, and we're not anyone else. We walk in with all of our prejudices intact, and they have to be pierced and informed and sometimes laid aside, sometimes not. But the difficult work of being with our people, the difficult work of learning a language is that immediately you become vulnerable, and then all the other limitations that you feel come to the forefront. In Guatemala once, I was with Father McSherry. We went to the Chrism Mass on Tuesday, not on Tuesday, on Holy Thursday morning. It was the dumbest thing ever to have it in a diocese where transportation and communication is extraordinarily difficult. The bishop decided to have the Chrism Mass at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning. But Father McSherry loaded up the entire parish staff, all of whom were native Tsutujil-speaking indigenous people from the village, and we all went over to the cathedral for Chrism Mass. And after the Chrism Mass, they packed the lunch, and we came over to one of the great overlooks that overlooks Lago Atitlan. It's gorgeous. It's this gorgeous volcanic lake. You guys know, you've been there, some of you. And it was one of the overlooks, and we were there, and the people in the staff, especially Father McSherry, was the most charismatic and the most interesting person and everybody wanted to be around him. And he was there, he was joking with all of the people. Everybody was having a good time. We were on our way back to the village, and it was in a big overlook, and there's a little parking space, and a grandmother and her granddaughter came over. And the granddaughter, they're all standing there, and all these people are dressed in their native traje, their native dress. They're all speaking to each other in Tsutujil. They all look different than this grandmother and her granddaughter. And so the granddaughter turns to her grandmother and says, "Who are these people?" And the grandmother says back to her granddaughter, "They're the little inditos who come from around the lake," the N word in Latin America. And she says it right to her granddaughter. And then she explains to her granddaughter that they're not like we are. They don't work like we do. They don't care for things like we do. And all of those people, all of whom I knew by name, in a moment became like statues. I mean, the expression drained from their faces. They knew how to react, which was to be completely impassive and make sure that the wall between them and her was impermeable. It was the most astounding experience I'd ever had, watching that, of course, as an outsider. To watch the cultural experience at work there, part of me learning their language at that moment. You have to, it is to confront the limitations that we have. I could never be inside of that kind of conversation. That's their experience. But I know that I grew up in the kind of soft racism that was just like that. And I had to learn how to think beyond that and learn beyond that in my own life. It's ironic to me that I've spent almost all of my priesthood around people who don't speak English and don't look like me. It's probably God's one way to save me from out of the world that I was born into, because I was born into a world where everything was divided according to what language you speak and what color of skin you have and what you look like. I was 35 years ordained before I was in a parish that was majority English speaking. And now I'm in a parish that's not majority English speaking again. We have to learn our limitations and how to get beyond them. And last of all, we have to work at it. To learn a language, whether you're learning the language of your people or you're learning Spanish or Tsutujil, learning is hard, and we have to work at it. We have to work at it because it's hard. But we have to remember this too. And this comes from Archbishop John Quinn as well. He said, "Men, look around. This is the best possible time in the history of the church to be a priest. There's no societal reward that muddies up your decision about whether to become a priest or not. Nobody's thinking it will place me in a higher level of regard in society at large. That's not a temptation. And as priests, we're all pretty much in this together. You know, one of the things that wearing an amice would do is to cover up the distinctions between a rich priest and a poor priest, a priest from the upper class and a priest from the lower class. By putting an amice on and covering all of the distinctions, the priest at the altar was simply the priest at the altar. That's not a concern for us. It's the best time in the history of the church to become a priest. There's no temptation to uphold our status. There's no special class to protect, and no temptation to grand success, at least not in the eyes of those around us. Because of those things, as Archbishop Quinn would say, we're free to get to work. What our work will do will make sure that we are different. And the world loves to divide and to cast suspicion. And the invitation that we have is to go beyond that kind of suspicion. And finally, if we speak the language of the people, then we enjoy the opportunity to become good preachers. Remember that the work of preaching is to bring the word to the people and ignite it inside of their lives. It's not to teach, it's not to analyze, it's not to describe, it's to make the word alive in the lives and the hearts of the people. If we don't speak their language, then the chances of them receiving the truth that comes from the scriptures is minimal. Our work, and we have to work at it, is to be able to preach in the language that is theirs, so that the call of Peter, the experience of Jesus casting out demons, calling Lazarus forth from the tomb, aren't simply scenes that come out of the pages of the scriptures, but that's what's happening now in the lives of those who hear us. By speaking their language in the words that they know and the expectations that they're familiar with, we can risk making the words of the gospel explode in them. The great image, of course, is that the word of God is like a two-edged sword. A two-edged sword, the kind the Roman used, was not used to slash. You only cut somebody when you slash. It was made to stab. When you stab somebody, it's in them, even before they know it, rearranging what's inside. If it's a Roman sword, rearranging what's inside is pretty bad news. If it's the Word of God, rearranging what's inside is pretty good news. That's what the Word of God is supposed to be. It can only happen if we know the language of those, if we learn the language of the people that we serve. Luke Timothy Johnson said it best when it came to preaching. He wrote in his book, The Real Jesus, he said, he teaches at Emory, at least he was teaching there then. He said, I'm going to have a 3-hour course on the New Testament, and the students are going to come 3 hours a week, and they're going to listen to me talk about the New Testament and about Jesus and about the different literary forms and all the things that we conventionally teach about the scriptures. And at the end of the course, I will ask questions and they will answer them. They'll get their grade and everyone will go home. He said, can you imagine what would happen in this class if Jimmy Swaggart taught them for 3 hours a week? Everybody's life in this class. If Jimmy Swaggart had a 3-hour crack at them, or a 1-hour crack 3 times a week with them for an entire semester, every single one of their lives would be different. Because preaching isn't teaching. He was simply mourning the fact that he wouldn't have a chance to have the Gospels come alive in their lives in a way that would change them. Stan Rother became a martyr, a witness to the power of presence and ministry to change people's lives. A witness to the power of that change to stretch the 2,000 miles between Santiago Atitlan and Oklahoma, because it's changed the lives of innumerable people in Oklahoma, because he learned the language of his people. And when he learned their language, he was able to stand with them. And in standing with them, he was transformed, and his transformation prompted their transformation. So that, what is it now? 44 years after Stan's death, their lives are still in the process of being transformed because he learned their language. That's our invitation. In fact, it's our imperative. We have to learn. We have to learn to speak. We have to learn their language.